Welcome, everybody, and thanks for joining us. I think we'll start. So welcome to the last dialogue of this year's set of dialogues, looking at a range of coal scenarios. And this session is going to be facilitated by commissioners. So Shamini, I'll hand over to you.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. We've got a very packed lineup, but a very important discussion to be had today on the coal closure pace. It is the last in a series of energy dialogues that we've been having over the past few months. And so, although the most important discussion, I would say, and very topical at this point, we've got some key experts in the room. I'm going to mention maybe a few of them, but really just a packed lineup, and I'm quite excited to hear what all of our experts have to say. The way we're going to structure this, so we've got Jessie Burton from the UCT, who's going to take us through some of her work on coal closure scenarios. Very excited for that. And then we've got Mr. Eric Shanmugam from Eskom, and really lots of work going on in Eskom at the moment, very topical. We've had a discussion on Komati as well, so very keen to hear from you. Welcome. And then we've got Nix Lesufi from Minkosa, who's going to also talk to us from a mining perspective. So a very packed agenda. If you'll see, there's the agenda there, just to run through what we are looking at today. I'm going to just do a little bit of a framing here, which I'm doing right now, and then we'll have the three perspectives. And then I'd like to open up for some Q&A. And thereafter, we're going to have two responses that are going to hopefully stimulate some really robust discussions from civil society. And then I'd like to then facilitate some conversation with the audience. So that's where we are at for the day. I look forward to the conversation. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Jessie. Jessie's at the UCT, and like I said, has vast experience on coal scenario work, and has also done quite a bit of work on the just transition. So very keen to hear from you. Welcome, Jessie, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Shamini. Let me just try share my screen. Excellent. Can everybody see that?
We can, and it is on presentation. Wonderful.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. So I'm going to talk today about the pace of coal plant closures in the context of climate action. And I've actually been given an impossible task in that I have to try and synthesize actually decades of really deep, technical, nuanced work, not just from the ESRG, my team, but also from other modelers in the country, and try and pull out for you some of the findings and comparisons across all of those modeling scenarios. So we are going to go super fast through many, many different scenarios, and I'm going to try and contextualize a little bit why we're looking at coal, kind of based on some of the international work that's being done. In that, we will, of course, miss a lot of nuance and detail, but pull out, I hope, some of the ways that all of these research exercises are finding coherence and interesting and similar findings, and then kind of a few areas that need a little bit more work as we go forward. So first of all, why coal? Coal is both important globally and in South Africa, and in different ways. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about what are the variables that impact all of these different modeling studies, so that people can understand why the details might differ, but the findings are still kind of similar. And then I'm going to go through all of those major local analyses. So looking at the work by NBI, the work by UCT, the work by CSR and Meridian, and how that compares to the Integrated Resource Plan, the IRP 2019 of the DMRE. And I think what's really important is that despite all these different variables and drivers, there is a coherent view around the role of the coal fleet. It is probably the most important and major area of mitigation that South Africa has in the short and medium term. But there are these areas that we need a lot more work, especially around air quality and some of the technical parameters around the coal plants. So first of all, why coal? Globally, coal is a very large source of warming and emissions. And we can see in international climate analyses, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, says we cannot achieve 1.5 degrees, or we cannot limit warming to below 1.5 degrees, which is the goal of the Paris Agreement, unless we have strong action to cut emissions from coal. Coal is the most emissions intensive fossil fuel. So compared to gas or oil, it has higher emissions per unit of energy. And in fact, it's been the single largest source of global temperature increase so far. It's responsible for more than a third of the warming we've already experienced in the world. For those who are not kind of familiar with global energy and climate numbers, coal use accounts for about 40% of global fossil fuel and industrial emissions, so almost 15 gigatons, which is 1 billion tons of CO2 per year in 2018. And importantly, around 2/3 of this, around 10 gigatons, are from the power sector. And this is important because they're technically feasible and cheap alternatives to coal power plants, and these are already widely available in the power sector. It's a little bit more complicated in sectors like cement, for example. We can see that there's been a slowing demand for coal over many years. Coal use peaked in 2014, and of course it's gone up and down, and it's gone up a little bit because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but we are seeing structural decline in many major markets. But what we see from this international work is that 1.5 and 2 degree pathways, there's two major challenges around achieving 1.5 and 2 degrees with coal. One, there's still a new global pipeline of coal plants. 500 gigawatts of new coal plants have not been built in the last 7 years that were planned, but there are still many in the pipeline. If you exclude China, in fact, the world is now seeing a net decline each year. But a lot of work has also gone into looking at the retirement of the existing fleet. And what we can see is that in 1.5 and 2 degree pathways, you actually have to have early closure of assets. And this work has been done over many years. UNEP 2017 is cited there, does a huge review of the literature. What else can we see from the international and global climate modeling? So if we want to get to well below 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, there are two goals in the Paris Agreement. Emissions from coal have to go from that 15 gigatons down to between 4.4 and 8.5 by 2030 for well below 2 degrees. And for 1.5 degrees, it has to go to 3.3 gigatons to 4.8 gigatons by 2030. So that target basically translates in between 50 and 80% reduction in absolute coal use this decade, and between 67 and 78% for 1.5 degrees scenarios. I mean, this is an unprecedented decline. And coal power in all of the IPCC scenarios, it did a special report on 1.5 degrees a few years ago, shows a steep reduction in coal power. It essentially goes to zero by 2050. And this is because although you can put carbon capture and sequestration, CCS, on coal plants, the residual emissions are still very high. So there is some coal use with CCS in these so-called hard to abate sectors, but not in the power sector. And this is a bit different compared to oil and gas, where you do see some differences across scenarios in how much oil and gas grows or changes. Coal uniformly falls. But these international analyses are not enough. We have to also think about the local context. So these kind of global analysis, this global modeling is often based only on efficiency and not on questions of equity and not on how much emissions a given country has compared to others. And so these distributive and just transition and cost questions are very important domestically. So what's the local context? In South Africa, we already know that new renewables is the cheapest new build option. And the two slides here show some work from Meridian Economics, just comparing the costs of the existing coal fleet against new wind and new solar in 2020 and 2030. And we can see that they kind of are predicting or forecasting that very rapidly, even the operating costs of the coal fleet will be higher than new renewables. So you save money by having new RE compared to existing coal in some cases. In South Africa, like in the world, coal is our largest source of emissions. The power sector alone is 43% of South Africa's emissions. And of course, it's one of the areas where we have these cheap, cost-effective and technically available options. South Africa has the highest dependency on coal in its energy sector amongst the G20. This, of course, has energy security implications. We have an aging fleet. We have plans to close 12 gigawatts between now and 2030. And of course, we're in stage 4 load shedding that this reliance has brought to us. There've been 11 different studies in South Africa looking at whether we should build new coal in the country. And they all agree that new coal plants are not competitive and are not part of what is called a least cost system. So a system that is cheapest and lowest cost doesn't have new coal in it. And in fact, building new coal would add costs. So that's a separate debate. We're actually going to be talking about how quickly we should close coal, but that's a really important part of the discussion. And around that, of course, Eskom has made net zero commitments, which were approved in 2021. South Africa's low emissions development strategy is aiming for net zero somewhere around 2050. So this changing local context is important. We've also got really deep challenges in South Africa around air pollution compliance and Eskom's financial situation. So Eskom is very capital constrained, and to meet the air quality rules that have been in place now for 10 years, more than 10 years, they would need to invest heavily to meet that across their fleet. They haven't done that in the past, partly because they haven't got the capital to do so. But there's been a recent court case where government has now been told by the courts they have to hold emitters accountable. This is important from a legal perspective, but also because there are 5,000 premature deaths in Mpumalanga every year. The DFFE's own numbers show that there are very high levels of asthma in the region, double the national background. And so Eskom is really in a bind here. They have to take plants off to retrofit them with money that they don't have. But this is a really important part of this climate discussion, and there's very limited analysis looking at the intersection between air pollution and climate. And I think Geraldine will talk to that later a little bit. So what do the local modeling studies say? First of all, understanding kind of what drives a lot of these results is really important, because I think people get really caught up in some of the details, this many terawatt hours or this or this. So very quickly, for people who are not modelers, a lot of differences in each of these studies will account for some small changes. So the demand forecast, how much electricity the country will need, which is driven by GDP and economic structure assumptions. Eskom's coal fleet performance is really important. How much can the coal plants actually put out and theoretically produce? How does that change over time? And what are the other technical parameters? So what is the minimum level you can run them at, for example? The greenhouse gas emissions budget is really important. So what can South Africa emit as part of its fair share? So I spoke earlier about those global modeling studies. Those global modeling studies are based on saying we have this much carbon budget for the world left. So the fair share is what is South Africa's share of what is left. And those budgets are different depending on what kind of temperature rise you're trying to not surpass. And of course, the method for calculating that fair share matters a lot. And you'll see, I'll show you some results later where we've looked at all different kinds of carbon budgets and how that impacts what happens to the coal fleet. End year emissions. So some of the scenarios I'll discuss are net zero scenarios. So in 2050, they are at zero or they are at very close to zero greenhouse gas or carbon emissions. And those are offset somewhere else in the economy. These models are also different. Some are power only, some are full energy sector. And then it may also change the results because the power sector is really important for helping other sectors to minimize their emissions and to decarbonize. I've mentioned air quality compliance. Of course, the cost and availability of alternative option is really important. How much will new renewables cost? Is there gas available? What is the capital cost of these different technologies? And I think despite all of these differences across all of the scenarios, I think there's remarkable consistency about the role of coal closure. It is one of the most cost-effective ways of meeting our mitigation targets across all of the studies I'm going to show you. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the NBR BUSA BCG work. They've got 4 scenarios, but 2 main worlds. And the main thing you really need to hang on to here is that the low emissions pathways has coal off by 2042 with a 3.5 gigaton budget for the power sector up to 2050. And then there's an IRP coal retirement trajectory, which follows the IRP coal kind of retirement and closure schedule, except that it closes Medupi and Kusile in 2049. And the main result there is that we can see when you follow the IRP scenario, you have a 4.4 gigaton budget, or you have 4.4 billion tons of emissions from the power sector over the period versus a more rapid phase out of coal, which gives you 3.5. Those 2 worlds have different costs and benefits. So in the low emissions pathways, you have more job years in the early period to 2035. You have lower cumulative emissions. You have very similar total costs across the 2 worlds, but in the early years, the low emissions pathway costs slightly more, but the total capex is not that different across all of the scenarios. It's around 75 trillion over the period. But we can see the important role of of bringing coal retirement forward in lowering that emissions budget. This is really similar to some work done by CSIR and Meridian Economics in 2020. And what Meridian and the CSIR did is they examined multiple different carbon budgets and costs. So they started out with the current policy trajectory, which is very similar to the IRP, but extended to 2050. They also analyzed a least cost pathway because there were policy adjustments in the IRP 2019 that were not least cost. And then they methodically lowered the carbon budget. The emissions are here on the x-axis. You can see over the period, there's that many million tons or billion tons, 2.5 gigatons. And they looked at kind of the effect of that on the system costs over time. And they assumed that the coal plants can retire if they run below 35%, but they can run at 35%. And they partially include air quality compliance. And you can see here that there are very, very small differences in cost from a current policy trajectory to a much more climate action ambitious scenario, which will cost nothing more, but will save more than a gigaton of CO2 emissions over the period. And they did this in different ways. They looked at, they lowered the budget and let the model choose what it wanted to build. And then they kind of tried to make it a more realistic build plan in terms of renewable energy. So they smoothed a little bit, similar to the IRP 2019. And they also looked at an ambitious renewables build out plan and taking coal off by 2040, based on some earlier work that UCT had done that looked at a 2040 phase out, which had found that a 2040 phase out was consistent with a more ambitious approach to climate change. But the real key takeaway here is that the cost implications of this high level of ambition is not that great, very similar to the modeling by NBI. This is showing you the same thing, but just in a slightly bigger and easier way of looking at it. And the really interesting findings here is that you can save between 500 million tons and 1,500 million tons, so 1.5 gigatons of CO2 compared to the current policy trajectory very easily. And the cost is really around 2.5%. And the mitigation benefits are very real. This just shows you the same thing in a slightly different way. These are the carbon emissions from the power sector. That's a 4 gigaton world. That's a 3.5. That's a 3 gigaton world. And that's a 2.5 gigaton world. And the difference here is really coming from how the coal fleet is run less or is retiring early. Very similar work from the ESRG, you might see, but UCT, which looked at how you could achieve the low range of our updated nationally determined contribution, the NDC. The NDC is our international climate target. And in 2030, it's between 350 and 420 million tons. And these are all different worlds. I mean, this is how many scenarios there are. You can see why it's such a hard ask to explain it all. But this, in all these different worlds, the emissions are between 370 million tons or lower. And this, and up or down, just says whether they cost more or they cost less than the IRP baseline scenario. The IRP PAMs are policies and measures, it's energy efficiency and the green transport strategy. And you can see that you can save a lot of money when you have all the PAMs in place, when you have more energy efficiency and you meet your energy efficiency targets down here, but you can also reduce the coal use and at relatively little cost, So we assumed here that the coal fleet could run at 40%. Remember, in the earlier scenarios, Meridian was at 35. We're assuming 40%. Otherwise, it must retire. And that's not that far off from where we are today in South Africa. We're at about 50%. And that's why you see in some of these scenarios, very large reduction and retirement in the coal fleet, 7.3 gigawatts here, 9 gigawatts less coal, 6.6 gigawatts less coal. But it really depends about, the costs are driven by taking coal off, but also doing other things, building cheap renewables and doing energy efficiency. Again, like in the previous scenario, so there isn't a huge cost difference between doing this faster. However, what we did after this is we started to think about, is it really feasible to retire these coal plants very, very rapidly? And we're in a situation where Eskom already has to retire 6 or 7 plants by 2030. There are huge equity considerations. There's the need to do the planning and the repowering planning and thinking about just transition. So how do you retrain workers? And that's a lot to be getting on with. So is it, our thinking was, is it really feasible to just to kind of double the retirement in such a short period? So we started thinking a little bit more about, well, what if we let those plants run less? So instead of running at 40 or 35, what if we have a lower annual load factor for the fleet? What happens? And you can see the effect of having that lower annual load factor can be really, really great. And of course, there are important trade-offs and benefits between keeping the plants on and running at these lower levels. This graph just says, look, if we assume that the plants kept running the way they are and we retired them as planned in the IRP, these are the emissions reductions between today and 2030. And you can see it's an important contribution, but it's not huge. But if you have emissions from here today and you run the plants lower at 40% average load factor, these are the emissions reductions and savings that you can make over a relatively short period. So this assumes a 40% load factor for the fleet, and we've actually gone all the way down to exploring 5%, which I'll show you in a second. So meeting the low NDC in 2030 requires an annual load factor of around 40%, as well as the retirements that are already planned. And of course, in the longer term, these ambitious fair share modeling see even lower annual levels of use from 35 down to 5%. So this is some net zero work that ESRG did last year for DFFE. There are a lot of variables, but I just wanted to show you how many scenarios we've done to kind of explore these issues. And in a 9 gigaton budget to 2050 or an 8 gigaton budget to 2050, you can see essentially all that happens is that the coal fleet reduces faster. It's shifted earlier. The timing has changed around the reduction in operations of the coal fleet. But it depends very much on other assumptions. Do we have energy efficiency? Do we have exports? How much is our land sink? What is that carbon budget? And in general, what happens is that when we let the model keep the plants on the system and run them at low levels, it wants to do that. And this is because then the plants are available to contribute to the reserve margin, and so reduce the need for investment in things like new gas or batteries. But because of these kind of ambitious mitigation scenarios, they're running down very quickly to that level. And we see this, although it differs across different future scenarios, between 2035 and 2045, the coal fleet is run down to the lowest level that you let the model run it at, basically. And this is just showing the same, but in terawatt hours. So you can see the coal fleet in a 9 gigaton world runs for longer at higher levels. The output is higher. In an 8 gigaton world, it shifts that forward. But it's still running these plants very little bit if you allow it to, instead of just retiring them earlier. Whereas some of that work from NBI and Meridian had a different approach. It said, what happens if we take the coal fleet off? We've done this all the way down to 5%, and you can join the PCC next week with the World Bank to talk a little bit more about these scenarios. But this shows you the same dynamic. The model likes having the coal plants as part of the reserve, but not to run it at high levels. Because coal is very emissions intensive, those emissions are very expensive in the system. If you have them in coal power, somewhere else which is harder to mitigate has to absorb that cost. And it's very sensitive to the cost of alternatives. So is renewables plus storage more or less expensive than the operating costs of these coal fleets? But again, when we set it lower to 5%, it very quickly goes down to that level. So consistent across all of these scenarios, we need faster renewable rollout immediately. This has multiple benefits. We can address supply security issues. We can enable Eskom to have the headroom it needs to do maintenance on the rest of the fleet. In the medium term, it could support improved air quality and the legal risks for government. It gives you a flexible approach to decarbonization in the 2030s. So we have to build out considerable amounts of RE now to address supply security, but also to give us flexibility around what we choose to do in the 2030s. This big build out of renewables can also support a just transition agenda if it's appropriately implemented. And I think across all of these, what's important is that all the analyses agree that the lowest cost options include reducing the output and or retiring coal plants earlier, although that's dependent on the technical parameters and those need further work. So can we run plant X at a 5% annual load factor, for example? Briefly, because I've gone over already, I just want to note that a couple of years ago, we did some work looking at air quality compliance scenarios, and we found that when you when you say to the model, you must meet the air pollution laws, and you can do that by retiring plants or retrofitting them. In a world without a carbon budget, it chooses to retrofit most of the plants. But when you start to add a carbon budget to that, it becomes inefficient to retrofit plants for the MES and then run them for a very short period or run them very little. And so what happens is that much less of the coal capacity is retrofitted and more of it is retired faster. And this was the first work that really said 2040 is kind of the date around which the coal fleet is going to retire. And I think it's just important to note that this really needs to be updated because there's new coal costs. There's been postponements since we did this work. We didn't have net zero commitments at that time. There's an updated NDC. A note on the IRP, and then I'm done. The IRP 2019 was developed in a context where the kind of speed of climate action wasn't yet well understood. So the SR 1.5 had just come out. It predated our updated NDC for 2025 and 2030. It predated the National Just Transition Framework and the DMRE's JET framework, which looked at managing the social consequences of this phase out. In the IRP, we assume a 50-year life for plants, and it excludes compliance with the minimum emission standards with the air laws. And that carbon budget used in the IRP is based on our much older climate targets, the PPD. And it wasn't able to assess the role of the power sector in achieving this updated NDC in the short term and in the long run, our net zero. And so when in the process of updating the IRP 2019, that needs to happen. For comparison, if we extended the IRP 2019 and as a current policy scenario, you get a power sector budget of between 4 and 4.5 gigatons. That's from Meridian and NBI. They've both shown it could be 1 gigaton lower at no cost and 1.5 gigatons lower at a very slight cost. For comparison, to meet the 2030 NDC and a 2050 net zero budget, our fair share for the country is 8 or 9 gigatons, and for the power sector, it's 2.3 to 3.3 gigatons over that period. So it'll be really important to explore in an updated IRP how to lower those power sector emissions by between 1 to 2.5 gigatons. And that will really be how to make the updated IRP compatible with our climate action. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessie. Wow, so much you've covered in such a short period of time. Well done. I understand that Geraldine was also meant to come in. So before we maybe do a little bit of a summary, because I've got some insights and I'd like to maybe conclude on this because it was such excellent work, I'm going to allow Geraldine to come in now. Geraldine Morris is from Carbon Trust, and she's busy doing a piece of work on behalf of the PCC. So with that said, Geraldine, if you could come in, I think it's a good segue to your work as well. Thank you.
Hi, Shamini. Yes, thanks, everyone. And I hope this is displaying properly in presentation mode. And everyone can still hear me.
We can hear you. We can't see anything.
Okay. Just try and flick through. Is anything coming through?
Nope, nothing on my side. Anyone else? Can they see anything? Maybe it's just me.
It's okay. I'm going to give it a try again very quickly.
All right. And yeah, there we go.
Okay.
Put it on presentation mode, Jay.
There, yeah. Is that visible?
It is spot on.
Great.
Please go.
Okay, great. So you'll be relieved to know I've only got 3 slides. So really, yes, we have partnered as the Carbon Trust with the PCC and also with Jessie and her team at the Energy Research Center to look at what the potential is to accelerate the phase out of coal-fired power plants faster than what we're currently looking at as a country. So our work includes in testing the potential for the early decommissioning of these plants and assessing the potential avoided costs for the refurbishment and retrofits. Crucially, our boundaries for this is obviously the carbon constraints, and Jessie has given some numbers around that, and previous studies have also determined what those should be for the power sector, while ensuring energy security is maintained during the transition and beyond. So our approach to this is to bring together the processes and outcomes of two sort of technical pieces of work. One is a multi-criteria assessment decision-making framework that we're developing with our colleagues at Carbon Trust. And the other one is the techno-economic modeling exercise that the team at University of Cape Town will be undertaking for us. I think quite central to all of this will be that we do intend through the PCC to make sure that this is a very widely widely and broadly, sorry, synonyms, but a very, very strong stakeholder engagement of this process, which I think has been a criticism of some of those 11 studies that Jessie mentioned earlier. The multi-criteria assessment will really seek to look at answering some of these questions. So looking predominantly around policy and regulation, the economic reliance of the country on coal in terms of things like job creation and trade. And it will also look at several of the just transition components that are not necessarily answerable in a techno-economic modeling exercise. And I think one of the areas, again, critically, and also just echoing a point that Jessie made earlier, is testing the extent to which it may be at this point more costly to keep running and maintaining coal than it would be to replace it earlier than waiting for the end of technical life. Oh, wait, sorry, jumped ahead of myself. Then the techno-economic modeling exercise will focus on 3 scenarios to consider how we can phase this down earlier. And again, I think Jessie alluded to a lot of this and the critical importance of these sort of semi-answered or unanswered or kind of outdated questions. So one of the critical things we are looking to do is to test some of the assumptions and some of the assertions made around the need to meet the minimum emission standards, and in line with the recent court cases and the very, very high risk that there'll be no further postponements allowed, and what that means. So if there is a full early shutdown based on compliance with these air quality standards, or if we look to retrofit these power plants. So again, trying to take a bit more of an independent market-based view of costs and some of the other technologies that might be available to do this. And then allow the model to run this cost optimal scenario of what to retire and what to retrofit within, as I said, the context of the carbon budget for the sector. And as I say, also to ensure that we have energy security throughout. So this is a piece of work that we have started to get started on over the last month or so. And hopefully, as I say, we'll answer some of these questions and will help inform policymakers and generally be useful to, I guess, the public at large. So we're looking forward to engaging further on this piece of work. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Geraldine. Wonderful. It's so good to see that we are actually taking forward the work that we have done. We've got a few other presentations. We are a little bit over time already. However, I want to be able to just summarize and contextualize what we heard from Jessie, because I think it's so critically important. I mean, what Jessie has alluded to is, number one, there's a lot of work going on in the economy. And really, there are some key sort of common threads that come through all of these different studies and scenario modeling. For me, things that stand out is, number one, renewables is a no-brainer. We need to roll it out fast, and we need it as a basis for all of our ambitions. I think the energy transition work for me overall really indicates that we need to balance emissions, energy security, affordability, and other social components. Reducing emissions is more of a constraint, and we can't be increasing emissions. We recognize that truly, but we also need to significantly reduce coal. What we have to decide on, and I think I want to open that up for some conversation a little bit later, is how do we decide collectively on the pace at which we decarbonize and how we decarbonize our coal fleet? So Jesse has described the complexity of this and some of the key things we need to consider. So keep some of these key things in mind as we go through the discussions, the different perspectives that are coming through, and how different stakeholders, constituents who are key to this discussion are actually thinking about this. So with that said, thank you again, Geraldine, for telling us about how you're going to take this forward, and Jesse. We will come back to you just now when we open up to some conversations. I do want to bring in Eric. Eric, it's really, really key that you are here to talk on behalf of Eskom and what you are doing. Eric leads some of the generation teams at the Eskom, and ultimately reports into the CEO. So welcome, Eric. Over to you to take us through what you are doing in terms of coal closure. Thank you. I see your slides already. Thanks. You can put it on presentation. Eric, can you hear me?
Right.
Yes.
Just confirm if you got it on presentation mode.
It's not yet. I'm looking at your slides in PPT. Okay, if you could just go to the bottom of the screen and just put it on presentation. There we go. And you can duplicate slideshow.
Fantastic. Right. Colleagues, so thank you very much. I think it was great hearing the introduction, and I think it sets the tone for what we must do in Eskom. And I think we've started the journey, and you probably heard the GCE over many conversations. You heard Mandy Rambaros. But the reality is I'm charged in the generation business to also socialize it with over 9,000 people in the business. So you can imagine the task. And I think, you know, whenever we have these conversations, we have to put people at the forefront. So in terms of the, I think looking at the issues around Eskom, we appreciate there's been several developments. And I think as Eskom, we don't operate in a vacuum. And so just to give a little bit of a context, I do appreciate you've had other webinars and you may have talked about the JET, and you may have talked about, I think more critically, earlier this week on Komati. I think what I will do is sort of give the overarching view on Eskom's plan and the shutdown plan, which Eskom has actually approved at the Eskom Holdings Board. But having said that, I think you're aware that we have a new board in the last 3 weeks, and I'm sure some of the documents that we have put forward will be thoroughly reviewed by the existing or the new board. So from a global context, I think we see clearly a shift away from coal. But I think if you look at the recent developments in Europe, if you look at some of the developments in Australia and even the US, I think more specifically Europe and the Ukraine-Russia crisis, we are starting to see some of the European countries go back to coal. But I think just reading some of the literature, it's a short term, just in terms of the gas crisis. But there would be other mitigation measures to still keep to the trajectory. We are seeing coal shortages in the medium term. We've seen, I think, just from a country perspective, that the coal exports have gone up by about 760%. But I think most importantly, South Africa and Eskom are signatories to the Paris Agreement and our pledge to net zero by 2050. Just giving a South African context point of view, we're seeing much lower GDP. We've seen this, further impacted by COVID, and I think the country is in recovery at the moment. We've seen these carbon tax, come into law from 2019. But more importantly is we've seen the cost of renewables. If one compares bid window 1 to the latest bid windows, we've seen like over 88% reduction in costs, which is very positive. Then when one looks at the electricity supply industry in which we actually operate, there are numerous policies and regulatory decisions that actually impact us, and we are starting to see the NDP. We know that the IRP is in critical need of being revised, and I'm told that this is being now driven by the Energy Crisis Committee. It's, I think, one of the key deliverables. And then from an Eskom point of view, we have the DPE roadmap. So we also have the legal separation that we're busy with. I'm fortunate in the sense that I've been given the task in generation to lead the legal separation. So, you know, with these very different and regulatory issues, you know, Eskom finds itself competing in this energy sector. More importantly, we've heard the president announce the threshold being lifted. And we've also heard now aggressively the municipalities are now permitted to procure directly from IPPs. So from an Eskom point of view, we know we sit with a very high debt burden. We've heard some good news from the finance minister yesterday, but I think the terms and conditions and the actual quantum of that assistance we'll hear next year, in early next year. So I think that's one of the big issues that we face in Eskom. More importantly, I think in generation, we know that we are letting the country down. We've seen a deteriorating performance. As you've heard, we are back at stage 4. Not good for the country, not good for the economy. But there's a recovery plan to ensure that we can at least get back to 70. But the minister is pushing the new board for Eskom to get back to 75%. And we know at 75%, the system is more than adequate. In fact, what the studies show at 75% EAF, it actually then justifies the early shutdown, not necessarily the decommissioning, but the early shutdown of some of these coal-fired plants. Lastly, I think we sit with the issues around the MES, and we've heard some of the comments come through. If we have to be fully compliant in the Eskom fleet, the generation fleet, you're looking at approximately 300 billion rand that one would need to spend to have full compliance. And the current reality is the balance sheet cannot, I think, handle this. But more importantly, you get 0 megawatts on the bar. And I think when one looks at these projects, the timelines to execute some of these complex projects doesn't justify the economics, because one would be nearing the end of shutdown. And in fact, in some stations, you would actually have to shut them down prior to the actual completion of the project. But having said that, when one looks at the present compliance rules in terms of the existing legislation, we sit with about 16 gigawatts of plant that's non-compliant. And then post 2025, there's a further 14 gigawatts, which then makes it 30 gigawatts that's non-compliant. Just some feedback from BCG. When one looks at, I think, the generation, specifically I'm focusing on the generation, I think the generation business faces huge challenges. And I think the greatest threats as we move into the future, into an unbundled state. We know there's quite a few things happening now in terms of competition, in terms of the IPPs coming in. And the SOEs become a much smaller component when one compares the extreme right-hand side of the unbundled state to the private sector. But having said that, for generation, I think it's important that we also reimagine the future, and hopefully through what I'm going to show you, we're going to get our hands on and get a fair share over and above what's in the IRP, but get a fair share of projects in the generation business to ensure that we can start to also embrace the renewables and introduce that as a mix into the generation business. I think just to give you a graphical view of the compliance issues with stricter legislation, as I've mentioned, you're sitting with close to 16 gigawatts that's at risk now, and post 2025, you're looking at 30 gigawatts. And I think these issues have not actually been considered when the IRP 2019 was actually promulgated. So that is a risk. If we have to implement the compliance, it would mean we'd go into stage 8, continuous load shedding, and then post 2025, you're looking at stage 15. And I think we've heard numerous calls, flighted by the group chief executive on the risk. So Eskom has appealed the decision. In fact, I had the privilege of presenting the mitigation plans to the MES panel that's been appointed by the Minister of DFFE last week. And I'm hoping that the mitigation plans have been sold together with all the other individuals in Eskom. And I think a balanced decision is then made to prevent us getting into this situation. And hence, we've asked for further indulgence. And the main reason for that is to actually prevent the spending of 300 billion. As I've said, many of these projects, if you start and by the time you complete it, you would have to actually shut down the plants. And hence, we've come up with a 2035 strategy. We believe it's a balanced strategy, and I'd like to share with you some of the actual outcomes of that. This is just to give you feedback and a view that in terms of the highlighted red, the various stations where we've actually identified abatement projects that have been approved. And this is what our commitment is to the mitigation in terms of the MES. When you look at the 8 power stations and in terms of full compliance, I've said you're looking at about between 30 and 50 billion rand per station. And that's how we actually got to 300 billion rand. Looking at the 2025 deadline, we believe with all hands on deck, it's unachievable. It's going to take between 7 and 10 years. I mean, if you take the flue gas desulfurization technology, we have now it installed in FG at Kusile, but we are going through some challenges. It's not new in the world, but new in the country, and we are experiencing some challenges. We have also committed to introduce this technology at Medupi. Several stations will be shut down before the installation, specifically looking at Matla, Duva, and Kriel. The others will shut down shortly after. You're looking at Matimba, Letabo, and Kendall. And then lastly, if you look at Majuba and Matimba, they are pretty much in very sparsely populated areas, and I think that thus limiting the health impact and the cost benefit. So in terms of a view, the Eskom views, we believe a premature shutdown of these stations would have serious impact. I think just in terms of looking at jobs, you're looking at potentially about 100,000 jobs. These are permanent jobs on the closure, and this would be direct as well as indirect. Specifically when one looks at Limpopo and Mpumalanga, you're looking at about between an 18 and 33% negative impact actually. And then in terms of the cost to the economy, you're looking at about 1.7 trillion. So this is due mainly through unserved energy. Looking at Eskom, in terms of the impact, you see a direct impact with regards to the balance sheet. I think this will actually further impact the operating shortfall by about 240 billion rand. Then we'd see a ballooning of the debt burden to at least 640 billion rand. Obviously raising here in terms of credit rating downgrades, and then ultimately potential defaults of up to 350 billion on the government guarantees. Then lastly, looking at the indirect impact on the economy due to the generation shortfall, we know that this potentially could mean national blackouts. Load shedding will intensify by over 40 times. And I think more importantly, we'd see further tariff increases of up to 170% on this present economy. So what we have done is pretty much, we've looked at the energy pathways up to 2050, and more specifically in the next 14 years, up to 2035. We've run numerous studies, and I think what's most important in terms of the study, there are 3 key questions that we needed to answer. One is, what is the optimal future mix and capacity for South Africa? And I think more specifically in the South African context, what is the additional capacity that we should actually require? And how do we maximize the socioeconomic benefits? And what are the impacts of the optimized shutdown? And I think specifically here, we're looking at water use. We know that some of these technologies require very high water use, and we're sitting in it with a very water scarce country, looking at emissions. And I think more importantly, looking at connections to the transmission and distribution networks. And I think that's very critical. And what the results have actually showed us is that there are key strategic decisions that we have to make. The viability of the shutdown, taking into account the system constraints, I think is very critical. Looking at alternative MES positions, looking at the optimized plant shutdown, and hence the push for the JET plan from Eskom. Looking at the optimal build of new technologies, and we'll take you through a few slides of what we believe the mature technologies we will use, specifically on renewables and gas. And then specifically, looking at 5-year increments in terms of the energy mix, starting in 25, then 35, 40, and then 2050. I think what one would see is that the coal fleet will definitely reduce, but there's a very high need for renewables together with storage. There were over 90 plus scenarios that have been modeled to actually decide on the optimal pathway for Eskom. The existing fleet will definitely ramp from 50 gigawatts to around 15 gigawatts by 2050. And I think in terms of the coal fleet, you'll pretty much have Medupi and Kusile that will be the only coal-fired power stations. The current projections show that by 2030, new capacity of about approximately 50 to 60 gigawatts renewables, together with base load, will be required. And I think that's very critical. As we speak right now, we've been very vocal in terms of we have a duty to recover close to about 5,800 megawatts, and we believe that must be done. But over and above that, to give us the opportunity to do maintenance, good maintenance, without being pushed to bring back plant faster than planned, there's a need for approximately 4 to 6 gigawatts additional capacity that's required. So I think that's very, very important. And this need we see actually doubling by 2030. So we've looked at the various scenarios in terms of the shutdown, and this is a very busy slide, but I think what I needed to highlight is that these were the so-called scenarios that were up for grabs, but towards the bottom left-hand side, 2C is the scenario that we identified, and we believed when one looks at 2C as a scenario, which I will share with you, it gives good balance to the new infrastructure and the expansion, distribution and transmission expansion, but more importantly, considering the pace of the new renewables coming on board. More importantly is to actually appreciate and look at the system adequacy and to ensure that the system's adequate. And then as much as we don't get to the least polluting scenario, but at least we believe that the most, in most cases that our fleet will at least comply with the MES. In terms of the technologies, I think we specifically are looking at PV, and we believe that with PV, we have identified potential sites to retrofit PV, capitalizing on existing infrastructure. And you've probably heard, we've also signed some agreements, I'll take you through that, in Limpopo as well as in Mpumalanga, where we are looking at using the existing transmission and distribution infrastructure where the renewables could easily tie into the grid. Looking at wind, we believe we can leverage the sites. We can also then get quicker environmental authorizations and capitalize on, once again, the existing infrastructure. On gas, I think use of imported gas, we know the gas prices are high. We've looked at gas in the Highveld, and I think sadly we lose efficiency, but I think gas prices in the Highveld also are quite expensive. Doesn't make it feasible. These studies will continue. However, Eskom's pushing for its first gas plant at Richards Bay. Nuclear, we believe we're hoping to hear some outcomes in the IRP. At this stage, we believe we have the competence to operate, and that's what we will do, is we will support government, once government decides to roll out nuclear. We know that there's, in terms of the research, there's lots of talk in terms of modular reactor and modular nuclear reactors. And if used, I think once it matures, would be good in terms of distributed generation. New coal, once again, we'll continue to operate our plants until closure, but we've made a decision that Eskom will not build any new coal. So taking that, I think, and just trying to, I think, put it into the Manhattan graphs, I think the bottom graph tends to, what it actually aims to show you is the closure of the various stations by 2030. I think more importantly is the red is the Tutuka. We are busy with finalized studies. We do appreciate as we start taking out other plants, Tutuka then becomes the actual tipping point in terms of grid stability. And we know that node is very critical to the eastern corridor of Natal. So transmission's busy with the studies in terms of how do we now cater for having renewables together with peaking as either your base load or peaking as coming in, gas coming in as base load or gas coming in as peaking to support that part of the network. When one looks at the renewables, in terms of the top part of the graph, you're looking at new clean renewables, about 50 gigawatts, looking at 53% wind, 26% solar, 11% battery. Now of this, Eskom is pushing close to 8 gigawatts of renewables, and I'll share with you what our plans are. Once again, from a process point of view, we will have to apply using a Section 34 with DMRE. I think once the minister approves, then we can proceed in terms of getting our share of what we've put on the table. In terms of the Eskom fleet, you're looking at about 22 gigawatts that will be shut down by 2030. Just very, very in a different format, but the same information. When one looks at post 2030, you'll be looking at 6 coal-fired power stations together with Koeberg. And then post 2035, you're looking at 2 fired stations, and that's pretty much your Medupi and Kusile. This is just to give you an indication of what we've identified. I wanted to put some granularity into this. So there's a two-pronged approach to the way we are actually looking at our share of projects. When you're looking at all the technologies, you are looking at pretty much the brownfields approach. So we'll be using the existing sites, and Komati will be the flagship site. And I'm hoping that through the conversations earlier this week, you would have heard all the good things that are happening at Komati. But having said that, we should have, our learnings are telling us we should have started Komati 5 years ago. And we would have been ready for the other stations, more specifically Grootvlei, Hendrina, and Camden. I think when I started the repurposing and repowering program in 2015, it's been a long journey. And I think critical to this journey was to look at what happens to the townships, what happens to Mpumalanga, because this is the node that pretty much loses all this jobs. So I think the big issue was, we had to take a very structured approach, and hence doing the social impact studies was very critical to that. And we started these studies around 2018, and some of these studies are now coming to actual maturity in 2022. And I'm hoping that in the conversation of Komati, some of the details would have been shared. I've got 1 or 2 slides here. So what we are trying to do, Komati, I think, would be the first in terms of brownfield, and the intent is to look at PV, to look at wind, to look at battery. In fact, the intent is to also look at synchronous condensers, how we could use the existing generators, put in synchronous condensers. And so Komati will be used as a pilot site. I think very critical, it will be used for grid stability in that area. You're looking at wind technologies. Going back to solar, what I want to highlight is, as much as we'll be waiting for the repowering and repurposing, we've identified, for example, Letabo. There's adjacent piece of land where there's 75 megawatts. We'd like to get a Section 34 and start with the ERA for Letabo.
I just note that we are considerably over time. I do want you to wrap up, but I just want to check with Nix, who's meant to leave at 3, if he can maybe wait for 10 minutes more so that we can allow Eric to finish and then hand over to you. So Eric, please, if you don't mind, it's key that you finish though. Please do take.
I'm going to be very quick and not repeat some of the earlier information. I think
sorry, Chair, I can stay on for a lot longer than that. I think maybe let's give Eric the opportunity to be able to give us the correct context. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Nick. Appreciate that. Eric, over to you.
Thank you. Really appreciate it. So I think when one looks at the generation capacity, what we want to do over the next 5 years is get our hands on about plus minus 7 gigawatts. But I think what's going to be more important is to see the developments coming out of the IRP, because the country is in need of much more than that 6, especially to balance against the 22 gigawatts that we want to shut down. And I think critical to this 22 gigawatts, it's base load. So how do we replace this base load with renewables together with the storage? Just on the transmission side, you're looking at potentially 8,000 kilometers of line. That's huge. Having been in the transmission business previously, when we had our peak, the best we could do was 800 kilometers. So this is going to need a lot of construction activities over the next 10 years. You're looking at about 101 substations. Then on the distribution side, you're looking at about 7,500 kilometers of line. This total portfolio of projects, I think the country, we are talking about 1.2 trillion. I think when one looks at the transmission and distribution side, that's what Eskom will push in terms of our portfolio. And then more importantly, on the generation side, there's about 8 gigawatts, which I've highlighted in this specific slide that we will drive. Then I think in terms of the approach and the modeling that we've done, we believe that this would give a much more balanced view to everything and not just one dimensional in terms of the MES. And we believe by using our approach in terms of the transition, you'd get a sort of a green and a go. Looking at emissions, there'd be at least a 50% reduction in CO2. You're looking at about a 66% reduction in SO2 and a 58% in particulates. Then once again, what the plan proposes is 22 gigawatts of coal being replaced by 7 gigawatts. Once again, the 7 gigawatts, a big portion of that would be running at a load factor of about 30%. So you can imagine what the country is going to need. More importantly, you're looking at about 300,000 jobs, after the coal shutdown. And I think this is what we're going to have to really build on. Transmission and distribution, I've highlighted over 15,500 kilometers of line that needs to be built. And then the other big issue is savings on water. I think that for me is very critical. The second column, I think I've highlighted the negative of shutting down immediately, specifically complying with the MES. But there's just some other feedback, just in terms of, once again, Eskom playing its part in enabling the country in terms of new capacity. We've identified over 30,000 hectares of land across the country with a potential of about 7 gigawatts of PV capacity. And we believe, optimizing and mitigating this specifically has been done to move away from the Southern Cape and the Western Cape where it's saturated, and we've got constrained transmission networks. So we believe if we can push this towards Mpumalanga and Limpopo, stimulate the economy, create jobs, but also use the existing infrastructure. And while we do that, Eskom transmission then can get on with the program of building the other strategic servitudes actually required. But looking at this, we also believe in unlocking this capacity. We've identified 12 projects, 27 transformers, over 8 billion in the North Inland region, increasing that capacity of about 12.3 gigawatts. Then we've also identified another 10 projects with 18 transformers, about 5.8 billion in the South Inland region, increasing the capacity of about 4.7 gigawatts. And this has been in the media. You've probably heard it, that Eskom, signed lease agreements with independent power producers. We've specifically looked at 2 areas around the Majuba and Tutuka. There's been parcels that have been identified, and ultimately 6,184 hectares has been identified of 2,000 megawatts over the next 25 and 30 years. So I think the bidders will now go and do their comprehensive feasibility studies and determine which technologies would be most suited. In the next phase, we are looking at the Kendall and Kusile power stations. There's pockets of land, and then also looking at Ingugan, which has been retired for many years in Newcastle, and that will be in the next phase. And we believe, using this as a strategy from Eskom, there's an opportunity to earn some revenue from these pieces of land, but also enable the country in actually building new capacity. Just one quick highlight, because I think you've done this a lot on Komati. We've identified Komati as our flagship. On the left-hand side, we've marked out and mapped out areas that we will be doing the repurposing as well as repowering. You're looking at PV of about 100 megawatts and 50 in the Ash Dam area. You're looking at battery storage. The gas studies were done, as I've highlighted, it's not feasible. Once again, biomass would be good, but not feasible. I think it's about having product, not enough product. And then the conversion of the generators to synchronous, there's 3 that have been identified in the first pilot phase. In terms of repurposing, you've got the microgrid assemblies. I think this will create opportunities for jobs. There's about 250 jobs identified. And then in terms of agrivoltaics, huge opportunities for farming. In terms of Komati, once again, I think the intent was to look at 5 pillars. The intent is to stabilize the economy, create the jobs. Once again, look at how we could develop employees, upskill, reskill in that area. We've also signed an agreement to build a training facility in that area. And that then creates an opportunity for us to not only train this kind of capability for the company, but for the country. And, Eskom goes back to when we used to do that in the good old days at the Eskom Academy of Learning, where we used to train these kind of skills for the country, specifically the artisan type of skills and the technician type of skills. Once again, I think the intent is to create some focus, strengthen the communities, by addressing the gap, because right now, in my personal engagements, we're going to have to really do a lot to ensure that these communities are uplifted. Most importantly is to up our game in terms of the stakeholder management. It's about communicate, and more importantly is how can we play a role to facilitate growth. We believe there's huge opportunities to build SMMEs. Over and above the three stations that we've already started some 3 years ago, Komati, Henry, and Krotvlei, we've now summoned studies for a further 7 stations, Arnott, Kriel, Tutuka, Matla, Duva. But the key objectives is that there's a total of now 10 stations that we are looking at. As much as 9 will be closing down by 2035, we still want to include Kendall so that we can get a head start, but it's just to understand the impact of the shutdown in these specific areas. And I think now that some of the studies, we are starting to see some details, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And once again, we work with the DMRE, because ultimately the DMRE is the custodian of the just energy transition, and we'd want to be part of that in terms of doing our bit as Eskom. So in my last 2 slides, Chair, I think what I need to highlight is that we will be shutting down quite a few stations, and we'll ensure that they operate to the end of their life, get the maximum benefit. I think once the new capacity comes in, once the country sees this new capacity, can also then allow for us to bring down the utilization. Our fleet is operating anything between 85 and 95% utilization, which is incredibly high, and you sit with an average of about a 40-year fleet. There's opportunities to develop alternative, generating capacity, energy solutions. Once again, we have a commitment to reduce the carbon emissions, and we believe that by shutting down the stations and looking at the renewables, we can use the just energy transition as a strategy to actually reimagine the future for Eskom. And we believe in doing this, introducing newer technologies. We could also have a positive role to play in terms of the social impact. And then so in moving forward, we will continue to implement the plan. And I think depending on how the new capacity comes in, that will also depend in terms of the shutdown pace, but this is what has been approved. We'll focus on repowering and repurposing. Quite a lot of work that's being done now by the World Bank at Komati, and we know we've signed on a memorandum of understanding with the Dutch government. But it's important that we take the learnings and we start to implement in the stations that are coming up, focusing on the new technologies on gas and battery. And I think in terms of our approach, there's two parts where Eskom will do a traditional, where we take the projects. So the likes of Komati, we will do that. We will run it. We'll try to find the funds. Same with the Letabo. But I think it's important that we also get the private sector involved. The land lease agreement's a good, I think, example. But as the other repurposing and repowering initiatives come in, we're going to have to look at private and public partnerships. That's my bit. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you so much, Eric. Yeah, there's a lot going on here, and I'm so glad that you've come through to explain to us what your plans are. I think, some of the things that struck me is that you all are having to balance a number of competing issues. We have immediate challenges right now, and what you've put forward for us is really a view that has accounted for even water, air quality. I'm seeing in there coal decommissioning, because we've heard from even Jesse, coal has to come to an end, and we're seeing that. But how you do it, I mean, there's been a lot of innovation and a lot of thought into this process. There's a lot of questions, Eric, and a lot for you. So I'm going to ask you to please hang on for a wee bit more. In the interest of time, I'm going to move to next, and then I'd like to open up with some of the Q&A. So with that said, Eric, thank you for your time. If you could hold on, and then next, let's move to you on your perspective from the mining industry, and then we can open up to some of these questions. Thanks, next. Over to you.
Thanks, Shamini, and thanks to the Climate Commission for giving me this opportunity. I think the key issues that I wanted to raise actually has been raised. So I'm just going to zoom through to the final issues for consideration, which I think are quite fundamental in terms of the phased shutdown. So I think the first thing is maybe to make a certain acknowledgement. I think the first one is Jay-Z has made a case for, the what I might call the phased, closure of reliance on coal. So we do take note of that phase process. That's number one, and the Eskom team has also indicated the timelines that this thing entails. Now, I'm raising those two key issues because it brings us back to the fundamentals of how do we ensure that in terms of the mines that are supporting the power stations and the implications for them in terms of the closure of these power stations and the repurposing of them, what does it mean in the context of a just transition? Now, two things comes to fore. The first one, as a matter of course, the mining companies are supposed to have their mine closure plans in place. So they are supposed to have made provision in terms of when they're going to close and the nature of the post-closure economic future in those areas should be properly outlined. Now, the misalignment comes in terms of the timelines. So what the presentations from both Jay-Z and from Eskom has highlighted is how do we align the closure processes of the power stations vis-a-vis the closure processes of the mines supplying those power stations? Because if we don't, then we'll be missing the key issue of how do we deal with the community and the socio-economic impacts of that closure. Because if we collaborate in terms of what the mines have already put in place, what Eskom brings to the party, and what other role players needs to play in that transition, it would be a very good approach. So I just want to highlight the key policy gaps that we need to look at in terms of this one. So the mines have got a planned closure perspective in terms of the provision of resources, both for nature and for society. Now, the misalignment from a timing and from a scope perspective need to be discussed and between Eskom and the relevant mines. So that's the first key point to take home. The second point is the protection of the rights of the workers and the communities impacted by by premature or forced mine closure. Because if it's normal mine closure, there are plans in place. But if it's premature and forced in terms of the implications that we've just had now, then it means those plans need to be reviewed and the timelines need to be reviewed and the cost implication therefore need to be understood and the cost allocation need to be decided upon. Thirdly, you also need to create a collaboration between the government, employees, local communities, and the mines in terms of how to create alternative employment opportunities. Because even if the repurposing is going to retain a certain component of the workforce, the majority of the mine workers are not going to be able to be absorbed in that repurposed arrangement. And therefore, it's a new area that is being brought forward that we need to understand better. And it follows then in terms of the skills requirement for them to go into alternative areas. So in a nutshell, we then have to look at the resources required. One, the mining companies then have to approach the matter not only as a single mine, but they need to approach the matter in a regional context. So that regional approach need to be underpinned by some convener of one kind or another, be it ESCOM or some component of the state, need to have those convening powers to be able to determine a regional approach of how are we going to collaborate with other stakeholders, because it's not only the mines or ESCOM, but even other economic sectors in those areas needs to come to be able to understand what economic succession means in the light of the just energy transition. Because if it only relates to ESCOM or the mines, it may miss other role players which may well play a very important facilitation role in terms of creating other economic opportunities for those workers. Now, the final point is basically for the DMRE in particular to play a much more meaningful role as a convener and the creator of a framework of deciding the pace and the scope of the closure of the mines. But it cannot be a sudden closure as JC and the ESCOM team has put forward. And I'm fully in support in terms of the process that has been outlined here. All that I'm raising is simply the mechanisms of how to facilitate that to happen in a much more fair and better manner. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nix. Great perspectives and clearly some key things that we need to consider. I think some of the things that stuck in my mind is that this is a value chain and a value chain of impacts, risks, and opportunities. And it needs to be broader than any one company or any one entity. So in thinking about even ESCOM's decarbonization, we need to also think about the impacts downstream, what this means for timing, how do we engage, how do we align our plans? So critically important. And it does require some sort of government higher level intervention to coordinate all of this. This is the start of a dialogue here, but certainly some of the recommendations from this will move into the processes that we put in place for how we look at the just transition framework and implementing the framework. So we've got a number of questions. So I'm going to ask all three, well, four, even you, Geraldine, to put your videos back on. We've got a number of questions. A lot of it is for Eric, but Eric, I think you knew that. So I'm going to maybe go through some of them in the chat, and then I'm going to ask some of the people potentially to even come through. I see hands are already going up. I'm going to start with two from the chat, and then I will hand over to Bobby. So let me start with the first one. What about biogas? It's not necessarily addressed to anyone, but the question was openly indicated. I'm going to say, Jesse, from your side, maybe firstly, in terms of the scenarios, how does biogas fit into the overall plan, and how do you see this as a lever? Is it going to be big enough to be able to have an impact? And then, Eric, is there any input or regard for biogas within the processes or the mitigation strategies you've put in place for the decarbonization? So, Jesse, over to you first.
Thanks, Shamini. Oh, I'd have to go and check inside all of the scenarios, actually. I don't think it's playing a huge role immediately, but of course, biogas is like a very important potential avenue for getting energy services to communities, but I can't answer without going to look, I'm afraid. In most of these scenarios, what you're seeing, very high levels of wind and solar, potentially supplemented by a little bit more hydro, a little bit more pumped storage, batteries, and a little bit of gas. So I'm not, if there is biogas in there, it might also be so small that it's not popping up, but I would have to check, I'm afraid. Can I, while I've got the floor, just comment on Nix's input, because I think he raised what are absolutely the most important issues. Like the worker impacts, the social and environmental impacts are really about that value chain, and understanding that impact analysis is super important. We don't have a good plan around how to deal with the existing derelict and ownerless mines, the mines where there are kind of illegal syndicates moving in and remining areas, and that kind of coordinated response using a realistic closure profile is very important. Like there are 12 mines at least closing before 2030 in Mpumalanga, and there isn't enough planning and impetus. We're talking about plants today in particular, but the mining is just absolutely super important, and I want to just reiterate that. Thanks.
No, thanks for that, Jessie. Yes, again, I also want to reiterate the value chain and us having these kinds of dialogues, but more importantly, when we take decisions, it must be across all of the different issues before informed decisions are taken. I think the important word that you've raised for me, informed, it needs to be informed, it needs to take all these issues into account. Eric, I'm going to ask if there's anything on the biogas side that might be of relevance within your presentation.
Yeah, so I think on the biogas, we've done the study and it's not feasible. And I think it's pretty much around not having enough product to come in as a primary fuel. So that's been the issue. I can confirm that at Komati, we've looked at gas, once again, OCGTs and CCGTs. Once again, it's about the, I meant about the efficiencies, losing efficiencies, but then the issue around the gas prices. However, having said that, we are pursuing gas at Richards Bay, and we're looking at our existing OCG plants, and we are converting that to CCGTs. Then the other question I think that was posed was around, just help me.
So the other one was related to, well, there's a new one. What kind of gas technology is considered for the Highveld? Direct natural gas firing in existing boilers, co-firing natural gas with coal, gas turbines, other technologies. I think maybe if you can cover the full ambit that you looked at in the study.
Yeah, so colleagues, there's a group of technology experts that will give you all the details. All I can confirm is that we've pretty much looked at I think it's your LPG for and it's been OCGTs and CCGTs. Those were the only technologies looked at. As a combination for others, it was not looked at.
Okay, but Eric, I mean, just to reiterate what you said, this is really about gas for peaking, gas for base load, to be complementary with the other sources and only in the short to medium term is what I recall from your slide.
Yeah, I think one of the other important things is in terms of me leading the long-term strategy. One of the critical issues is not to overinvest in these technologies because it could be considered with standard assets, and I think Germany is a classic example of that. So it would be a very short-term, mitigation plan. Once again, used as peaking, and in some cases, I think base load in the short term.
Okay, no, good to have you say that, clear it up, because I think it's an important issue as to the volumes of gas we're talking about. But with that said, Bobby, you've been waiting for quite a while. Please come through.
Thanks, Shamini. Mr. Lesufi, thank you for your presentation, and it's good to hear that there's concerns about how do we deal with mines as a collective within the region. However, the DMRE and the Chamber of Mines' history has been very negative in this perspective, in that mines and new economic plans for the region have not materialized. All mines have closed and left people with the legacy of health, the legacy of a crushed economy. So I think I appreciate what you say, and I think we really need to get stuck in urgently to develop the closure plans for the mines now. We cannot say we never had warning of this. We've said already to Eskom in 2016, what are your closure plans? You know, and so we've been asking these questions for many years and we haven't had a good response. So I just want to say thank you, and you know, would be interesting to work with you going forward on this. In terms of Eskom, Eric, I don't understand, Mr. Shanmugam, is what's the difference between closure and decommissioning? I mean, Eskom must make their mind up. Are they going to close or they're going to decommission? You know, right. So that for me is important. And I want to ask the very important question is, why is Eskom as ours? Eskom is ours. You know, forget about all the shenanigans around Eskom, but it's ours. It's the state's. Why isn't Eskom investing in the rollout of its own renewables to be a producer as well, rather than just a buyer from some other entity? And if Eskom is going to go into the RE space, and they should go into the RE space, you know, how is that going to happen? Is critical. Thanks, Also, just one last thing. Sorry for hogging the floor. I think this issue about health versus the economy. I mean, come on, guys, that's ancient history. In Parliament in 2004, Eskom knew, and Dr. Olver was there. Eskom knew this was coming. And so the reality is now saying, well, you know, we can't do this because, you know, it's going to affect the economy. The reality is that we've had more than 2 decades to plan for this, and at least groundwork cannot stand by and say, well, we'll give up health because we need an economy. Because it's not, you know, who's dying here? It's not you and I. It's people on coal fields that are dying. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Bobby. I think there's a lot of input there. Next, if we could start with you, and then Eric could come in on the balance of the comments and questions. So next, over to you.
Oh, thanks, Bobby. I think the issue that I was raising is that we've got an opportunity to compare notes and do the art of the possible. So what I was saying is that the mines may have plans. You know, there are plans nonetheless with their imperfections, and it's up to us, all of us, you know, including Eskom, to see how we can jointly, you know, address the impact of the closures of the mines going forward. I think the evolution of the legislative framework also plays a key role here. For instance, no mine will close independently of its neighbors. So it's quite important that we adopt a regional approach. And when we do adopt a regional approach, we need to be able to define what constitutes a region, if we say it's a regional approach. And if that's the region that we agree upon, you know, what are the parameters and who has to take the final responsibility if it's a club of mines and other role players taking decisions about that. So there's still scope for us to engage. And I do welcome the welcome note that you ran. And I think we need to take this matter forward. It's either through the PCC or through our offline discussions further on. Thank you.
Thanks, Nix. I think the key thing is to learn from the mistakes of before. How can we do this better? And I think that was something that we've got to now build on, and definitely take Bobby up on this. You know, how do we bring in a broader suite of voices into the discussion, because it's only going to enrich it. Eric, over to you in terms of the key issues that have been raised, you know, the health issue in terms of how we're planning. So if you could come through.
Yeah, so Bobby, I think, and thank you very much for those questions. The issue around, let me close it here, because those are assumptions that we've picked down. Once we shut down the stations, we'll be looking at repowering and repurposing. Now, let me take you through an example, Kumati, which is very real. To prevent the complete decommissioning costs, certain pieces of the plant will be identified for repurposing and repowering. And we believe we could end up using that piece of land for repurposing and repowering within the boundaries of the power station. There are then other pieces of plant that have been identified that will be decommissioned, and rehabilitated. So I think to answer your question, the shutdown means shut down and we're not bringing it back up. So Kumati will be a classic example where Kumati now will be shut down and we'll actually move on with the repurposing and repowering. The whole intent, once again, is to prevent the huge decommissioning costs. So there would be some of the decommissioning costs that we would avoid. Okay, in terms of the assumptions that we've made, we will not be building no new coal. The one thing that I think I need to highlight is that in terms of, DMRE is accountable for being the supply of last resort. We do appreciate that Eskom has a huge part to play in this, but we can't build if we don't get the Section 34. Leading on to your other question is, we would love to actually build a huge piece of the renewables. The first challenge that we have is the balance sheet. We have such a weak balance sheet. Right now, our debt sits at 401 billion rand. It becomes very difficult getting the loans. But having said that, we believe, and that's being pushed by the GCE, we are also part of the presidential team, is to say, if we use the just energy transition, how can we actually use this as a trade to get our hands in this $8.5 billion? Okay, so that would be our way. And what we've identified, yes, there's a huge pipeline of projects. I think we've identified over 100 projects right now in this pipeline, but we've narrowed it down to the list that I've shown you, which will require about between 78 billion rand and 192 billion rand for this chunk that we've identified. So as I said, when one looks at the generation portion, we'd love to get our hands, and we are hoping that as we move into this journey, we lessen the burden on the balance sheet, because the funders, by the way, funders want to talk to us if you talk green. They are actually falling at your knees, because they have the money, but it's just that once again we just don't have the power to borrow that.
Yeah.
I think it's the last question. I think there were 3 questions.
Yeah, there were 3 questions, but I'm just aware of time. So I'm going to ask Eric, can we hold that? We'll come back to the conversation. There are some, responses to you regarding, the spend on gas and how we are actually looking at that. But before we do that, we have one more speaker with a response to everything we've heard, and I don't want to forget about him when we've got 25 minutes. James from the WWF, who's got a vast worldly experience around climate action and the issues we are talking about here. I'm going to bring James into the conversation as well. So James, if you can put your video on and come through as well, we really didn't forget about you and want to hear what you have to say. So what is your perspectives on this conversation and what we're talking about here, the coal closure issue?
James, you're on mute.
James, you're on mute.
Apologies, can you see my presentation?
Not at all, no, you can come through.
Okay, let me just quickly try that again. So I just want to point out that I'm on the agenda as being a civil society voice. I want to clarify that I'm a civil society voice. There are many civil society voices already on here. But so I think, when we're talking about the pace of the transition from the perspective of of the climate issue, it's very important for us to think about, what is driving it? What is the rationale behind the changing pace of transition?
James, still not seeing your slides. I think you've got to double click or do something more.
Interesting, it says it's sharing it. Okay.
Maybe stop and just do it one more time.
Yeah. Okay. It doesn't seem to be sharing. So let me talk, and then if it comes on, so much the better. So I think, one of the things is there has been an analysis of, what is a fair contribution? Jesse spoke about the carbon budgets. What is an appropriate amount for a developing nation such as South Africa, which has a lot of responsibility
Is it just me or has James disappeared?
I think James did, but I also had a dip. James, can you hear us? James?
He might have got
Doesn't
decommissioned.
necessarily.
Yeah. James, I think you might have just been load shedded or something.
Oh dear.
But I think you just better start from the beginning.
Okay,
Share.
apologies.
No problem.
Are you able to at least hear me now?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, well, that's a start. That's a start. I like that. What I was saying is, in terms of the fair share, there's a breakdown globally of what is a fair share for developed nations and developing nations, and it aligns with exactly what we're trying to achieve, where we're trying to get to in terms of limiting climate change, and for just a 50% chance, which if you were going to drive your car down a road, a 50% chance of having a crash is not a great one. But a 50% chance, we need to have phased out coal by 2040, which doesn't align necessarily with what we're talking about in terms of our trajectory. And for a 67% chance, we would need to do it much sooner. Developed nations have a much more rapid required phase out. And so this top row here that you may see talks about the coal budget. The bottom row talks about sort of other fossil fuels, and we would be this yellow line here that we're one of the developing nations, not a least developed country, but one that has this sort of additional leeway. But nevertheless, you see this shift happening. It needs to happen very quickly. So one of the questions that obviously that is in the debate is about pace is, we're talking about the pragmatism of dealing with our jobs and dealing with our infrastructure, making sure we have appropriate energy provision, but we also need to think about why we're doing it and whether our pace aligns with that. And we're also at the same time talking about the potential for developing a gas industry. And really, it's very clear scientific evidence that exploiting any new fossil resources cannot be undertaken and still achieve a 1.5 or even a 2 degree sort of trajectory for climate change. And so in the South African context, where we don't yet have gas but are thinking about it, it doesn't make sense to go down that road. And Jesse's spoken about how many of the models talk about, there is a, if you allow the model to run a lower proportion of coal, it tends to do that just to fill in some of the gaps. Now, our colleagues from Eskom will tell us that running coal at a very low availability factor is very bad for the plants, and that is absolutely true. But at the same time, in terms of the actual sort of risk and cost for South Africa, it's much, much lower than developing a whole new industry. So South Africa may be one of those special cases where you say, okay, well, some of that peaking energy that we need to bring in could possibly be provided by very low usage of the coal fleet. And that's what we've seen in some of these models. And it is technically feasible. It's been demonstrated. You can do, with a minor amount of modification of the plants, that you can provide some of this, and then it would be sort of 1 to 2% of the total availability in the sort of the later years, just for that seasonal load. But that doesn't really address the issue that we're talking about, because even that means a rapid drawdown in the coal industry, right? Which is what we're talking about. The challenge is really in the beneficiation, the supply chain, where all of these folks who are employed there, how do they beneficiate, sort of receive sort of jobs, how do we deal with them? And there is this question about where is, for South Africa, the biggest risk in terms of the employment, because decarbonizing, we know we have 93,000 jobs in the coal industry. Those jobs are very much at risk. But at the same time, failing to decarbonize our whole economy is a big issue, and it risks, this diagram here in the top left is all of the jurisdictions that currently have carbon prices. A lot of when countries put in carbon prices, they are likely to do as the EU has proposed, for 2026 to put in border carbon adjustments. And that means that when we're exporting carbon heavy products, which is what we have, to those economies, we have to pay their carbon price effectively for access, regardless of our pricing here. And so failure to decarbonize actually limits our potential to do exports. A lot of our industries therefore are impacted. And a lot of the argument today has been specifically about the electricity sector, which is a huge portion of our emissions as a whole and a huge consumer of coal, but is not by any means the sort of sum total of it. The cement industry has to use large amounts for the production of cement, and the steel industry, both of those which are developmentally critical, both use large amounts of coal. And so when we're talking about the decarbonization, the shift away from coal, we also need to think about what does that mean for those, and we need to be thinking about the planning for those, that the transition in those sectors as well. But we also need to bear in mind that there is a huge opportunity in doing that shift sooner rather than later. If we can decarbonize our steel industry through rapidly bringing in direct reduction from green hydrogen, so huge scaling of our renewables, then that means that we actually are leading. We can make sure we have that market access, but we're leading the sort of global trend in this way, and we have preferential access of our products to very large markets. And so we're very much focusing in general on in the transition process on, how do we protect what we have, but we also need to be very clear that doing it too slowly means that we fail to capitalize on the opportunities that are there in this transition. This is just a quick look at the recent coal prices, and you see this massive spike recently, and this is because of the sort of the energy crisis in Europe because of the war in Ukraine and because of their lack of access now to Russian gas. And so we're seeing a lot of countries bringing their coal plants out of mothballing, and effectively for the winter they're hoping to get the coal supplies. And so South Africa has been exporting a large amount of our coal to them. But this is not a long-term trajectory. This is very much a short-term blip. And what we're seeing is many of those countries, sort of Germany has brought forward their 100% renewable energy goal to 2035. They're planning on doing it entirely. And so really what we're seeing is for a lot of countries, the global energy crunch that's just happened is pushing the renewable energy transition forward. It's happening faster. And this has big implications for South Africa. Right now is a great time to be a coal company because you have these windfall profits and we're really raking it in. But in the sort of what it means is then the transition away from coal globally is happening much more rapidly. And we mustn't forget that when we're talking about move away from coal in our energy industry, a lot of the coal that goes into Eskom is through long-term contracts that's negotiated, but for the coal mines, there's a strong subsidization effectively of that by selling the higher quality coal of. And if that starts shutting down, which we're likely to see in the near term, we're going to bleed more jobs there. So I guess the point is that when we're thinking about this transition and the pace, we have to realize that we don't have the luxury of making that choice entirely independent of the world. We are also part of this whole global trajectory. And to some extent, our hand is being pushed here. And perhaps, in light of that, we need to be thinking, okay, regardless of our planning for the trajectory, we need to be targeting those windfall profits at the transition right now. This is where it's happening. It's we've got this income coming in, but we need to be thinking about energy storage in our mining areas, green hydrogen, using our acid mine drainage, right? So it's water we can't use for anything else, and tapping into the PV in our sort of coal areas, and also thinking about the restoration economy. And then just one last thing, which I think is very much sort of front of mind for much of civil society, is this question about the beneficiation, right? A rapid transition could happen very effectively. We're seeing this accelerated decarbonization happening, but the rapid transition could mean that we perpetuate or even accentuate the status quo, large centralization of or even privatization of energy, not a lot of beneficiation in the jobs. We're not really seeing the consultative process happening adequately. And so we see the transition being largely unjust. On the flip side, a slower transition could make the case. We have, more equitable outcomes, a more social legitimacy because we're doing this consultative process. We're able to roll out our plans, and so that you could say that this makes the case for civil society, that actually we would prefer it to be properly mapped out and incremental. But we would argue that we don't actually have that choice at the moment. I mean, the reality is we've got 6 of our coal plants closing before 2030, but we're likely going to see those plans for closure shifting closer as renewables come down in price, as storage comes down in price, as the international market for coal becomes reduced. And South Africa has a very poor history, as Bobby pointed out earlier, of planning for the mine closure and for the transition for communities dependent on those mines. So this means that I would make the case that the transition process is imminent, it's happening, and we have to try and plot this middle way, this just and effective, strongly participatory process, which the Commission has taken the first steps on. But we need to think about the transition as underway. This isn't something that we're talking about for 2035. And when we talk about the pace of coal closure, we can think about some sort of grandfathering and attenuation, but the reality is that the jobs and the beneficiation that are in the coal industry are moving away from us now. And we need to ensure this social justice while addressing the shift. It's not only in electricity, but in our economy as a whole. It's rapidly becoming not just a side issue or a hot topic, but it's becoming the central issue in South Africa's development trajectory. And I think this is how we need to think about it, and this is how we need to be planning going forward.
Thank you for that, James. I think you've made my job so much more easier because you've kind of summed up a lot of what has been said by many others. I think some of the key things on your slide just before this, the summary of we have to do this together. We have to have a collaborative ecosystem. I mean, that was said by Nix as well. We can't think about one sector on its own. We have to think about the whole thing. And perhaps there's an integrated view with some sectors moving faster than others, with recognition of what can be done where and by when. I think that's for me what's coming out quite strongly here. We do have a number of questions, and we're certainly not going to be able to answer all of them. We've got 10 minutes, and I'd like to still give some time for Dr. Olver to sort of sum up and close us out. I'm going to allow for 5 minutes of few questions. I'm not going to go to the chat, and I'm going to ask those who have, who are here, some of the commissioners. Melissa, you had a few questions. Can I ask if you'd be willing to take the floor and maybe provide some of your perspectives? You've raised some questions as well, if you're willing to do that. And any of the other commissioners that are here. Melissa, would you be willing? Melissa, you on mute? Oh, she's in a public space. Okay, she can't actually come through. Bobby, we've heard from you. Is there anything more you would like to reflect on?
For now, no. Shamini, thank you very much. Just get us the presentations. I think they were useful. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Bobby. Are there any other commissioners on that I cannot see? Because I don't want to forget someone. I don't see anyone, but I really think it's important that we do. Nix, you've spoken already. Is there anything you'd like to add?
No, thanks. No, nothing to add, Shamini.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. I think, this has been a really great conversation. I think we've put forward a number of key issues. We haven't landed on solutions, and I don't think this is by any means the answers are going to be given here. I think this is a start of a very long dialogue. Some key things that stand out for me is, pace and timing of the transition. which sectors. We only spoke about the power sector here. We heard from James, there are definitely other sectors that need to be brought into the debate. The petrochemical sector, CTL and its emissions, cement, we've got iron and steel. All of these are hard to abate sectors. What does this mean for the transition, and how do we look at coal as feedstock, coal as part of the electricity mix and energy mix for these different operations? What does the transition look like? And I think, as the PCC, these are key discussions that we need to take forward, especially when we start thinking about the updating of the IRP. We have got 8 minutes. I want to take then one more question from the chat, if the team would allow me. Nix, this is for you. According to the Statista, the 93,000 people employed by the SA coal mining industry earned approximately 31.4 million in 2021. To what extent can this remuneration threshold be used as a proxy to ring fence the risk posed by the JET plan on coal mining jobs specifically? This was raised by John Mathwasa.
Sorry, can you just repeat the question?
Okay, so I'll read, sorry, 1 minute. Let me just pick it up again. Okay, according to Statista, the 93,000 people, I think it's Stats SA, the 93,000 people employed by SA's coal mining industry earned approximately 31.4 million in 2021. To what extent can this remuneration be used as a proxy to ring fence the risk?
No, thanks. I think it's time dependent, because if it's sudden, then it can be used as a proxy. But if it's gonna take the timelines that Eric and Jesse has put forward, then it's much lower, in the sense that natural attrition will take place, and there'll only be a limited amount of workforce that need to be attended to, and that would be the proxy that would be for the just energy transition. But if it's sudden, then that would be a proxy. But if it's a well-phased out program which allows for natural attrition but takes into account the agency of the transition, then it will be a much more slow, a smaller number. Thank you.
Thanks, Nix. And I think the important point is that we are trying to avoid the sudden premature closures where there's shocks to the economy. So I think that's important to bear in mind. That's exactly what the Just Transition Framework has put forward in terms of making sure that we can do this so that just and equity, forms part of the underlying process. There's a few more questions, and Eric, this one is really related to the electricity sector in terms of what you guys are doing. What studies have been done relating to health, if any at all? And then also on rural areas and electrification. There's a few questions repeating on that. Maybe if you can come through.
Yeah, so I think in terms of the electrification, the microgrids we see as a great opportunity. When one looks at building and constructing distribution lines, and you do as a trade-off as cost against the microgrids, I think having the plants assembled at Komati and dispatching it, we have a pilot site. One could power between 25 and 30 homes for each of these microgrids. So we believe it's an opportunity. Equally, there's opportunities to line these microgrids on the national highways as charging ports for electric vehicles. But for rural specifically, that's one of the key objectives, is dispatching these microgrids where one could actually electrify between 25 and 30 homes. In fact, we've seen such positive outcomes for the ones that we've got on pilot, that those communities actually have taken their chicken fence nets and have actually ensured that there's closure to ensure that this infrastructure is protected. So we've seen some very positive outcomes out of this pilot study.
So you've also taken into account all of these issues, the need for energy, to be distributed further than where we are right now. You've looked at air quality, water, waste, and decarbonization, as well as the cost issues. That's what I'm hearing from you. It was a multifaceted approach in terms of what you were trying to deal.
100%. And I think, when one looks at the distribution strategy, there's a whole team that's looking at the distribution of the future. And I mean, there's a whole chapter on this specific microgrids.
Okay, thanks, Eric. I want to now hand over to Dr. Olva. Dr. Olva, you were meant to come in at the beginning, so apologies, but I'm going to give you time now.
You cut me unfairly.
Apologies, but you have the floor to close us out on this very important discussion. But I think it's critically important we have a further one. I think it was not long enough, but I'm sure we're going to do more of that. But over to you, Dr. Olva.
No, thank you, Shamini, and thank you for so ably chairing the session. It was incredibly productive. And, you know, I think you can really get a sense of the complexity of the issues that we have to consider, not just for today's topic, which is about the pace of the coal transition, but more broadly, you know, as we look at this energy transition and what our plan needs to be, you can see that we've got to balance concerns around people's health, people's livelihoods, the impact on jobs, the impact on our economy and our trading system and the various economic sectors. We've got to talk about energy security. We've got to talk about energy poverty. And of course, the thing that's, you know, driving all of this is this imperative to decarbonize, and to decarbonize at a pace that doesn't liquidate our economy and shut down industrial sectors before we've been able to build out new green sectors. You know, so, you know, we've got some very strategic decisions in front of us. If we move too fast, we destroy large parts of the economy and jobs. If we move too slowly, we're going to be stuck with this, you know, outdated, inefficient economy that gets shut out of the global trading system, and which, you know, is equally disadvantageous. And, you know, I think the point's been well made. We can't talk about decommissioning into a vacuum. We can't decommission power without the new power, the renewables that has to be put on the grid. And I think the one thing that everyone is clearly aligned on, the pace and scale of the renewables rollout has to be massively increased. 7 to 8 gigawatts per annum is what the modeling shows us is required. That's equivalent to all of the REI4P rounds to date. And that's got to go hand in hand with a massive amount of storage and the ability to balance the peaking power, whatever the technology source is that it comes from. So you can see this dialogue, you know, on the pace of coal closure is in a sense a fitting culmination of the series of dialogues that we started in July. So you'll recall in July we set out to discuss how we balance the electricity grid and what are these concepts, you know, is base load an outdated concept? How, you know, what are modern ways of balancing a renewable dominant grid? Then we looked at technological change and what its implications are for electricity system reliability. We then drilled into the investment required and how we're going to finance it. We spoke about industry structure, you know, this move towards a more decentralized, open, competitive energy system that's underway and how it's regulated and governed. The second last one was on jobs and the just transition. So we looked long and hard at what the different scenarios mean in terms of job creation and economic sectors. And now today we were discussing the pace of coal closure and the different scenarios for that. So I know it's not everything. There's some very important issues that we haven't completely drilled into. I mean, I was reminded by Richard Worthington in the chat that the Energy Governance South Africa Network has led a really interesting process to put this paper together on energy poverty and free basic services. And we've got to find time, you know, in the further process to hear that and other, you know, key inputs into this exercise. So what we're going to be doing next, I just want to give you a little bit of a sense of the next steps and the timeframes. We are in the process of writing up all these dialogues. They, you know, incredibly rich amount of material from a wide range of people, experts globally and locally. So we're going to be producing a set of, you know, 6 think pieces that have come out of these dialogues, and we're going to be circulating that and putting it on the website. We are doing a little bit of a sort of in-depth planning session with our commissioners. It's our net zero working group. So that's going to be taking place later in November. And we then want to go into a set of detailed engagements with stakeholders. I mean, I know some of you have said, look, this webinar format is not consultation. You know, you're getting a whole lot of expert views, but this is not in-depth stakeholder engagement, and we acknowledge that. So we're setting up probably, you know, this is towards the end of this year, but more probably early in the new year, a set of in-depth discussions with a whole range of constituencies, you know, organized labor, civil society organizations, community groups, young people, local government, the religious sector, the business sector, and of course, you know, the various government entities that are integral to this. And we're wanting to build that up towards a multi-stakeholder engagement. You know, sometime in the first quarter of next year. And we'll be putting out a draft energy transition plan. The intention is to, you know, once we've chewed that over in a stakeholder process, to put it into the commission and let the commission then make proposals, make recommendations to the president and to cabinet that get factored into this updated IRP process. We're obviously going to go a little bit beyond the energy mix. I mean, we want to look at a whole range of things and guidance, including how we govern and plan going forward. I mean, in some ways, this, you know, very static, rolling 5-year IRP process is a little bit inflexible for the kinds of fast-moving, rapidly technological change that's happening in the energy sector. So we may need a different kind of planning instrument, and we want to make recommendations about that as well. So on that note, Chair, I just want to thank everyone for an incredibly rich set of inputs. It's really been a fascinating journey with all of you. And we look forward to the next phase in this process of engagement. Thank you.
Thank you, Executive Director. Thank you for that, and it gives some clarity as to what we're going to do going forward, because certainly this conversation is just starting. And I think the thing that I take away is that the different key stakeholders are deeply thinking about this. And there are a lot of commonalities, but there's also some divergent views where we need to find the middle ground option. And I think you've said it well. I think there's some hot topics that we need to take forward. I do want to tell everyone, thank you for participating. Thank you for all your questions. Thank you to the panelists for some great insights and perspectives. We will endeavor to answer all of the questions that have been put forward, or even by email or even on the chat still. And we will definitely be taking forward this conversation next year. So thank you for your time, and I'd like to close the session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, colleagues.
Thanks, bye.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Shamini.
everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.
You leave.